Good evening, everyone. We're so pleased to have you join us this evening to listen, as many of you did last year, to esteemed and best-selling author H.W. Brands, the Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Brands has written more than a dozen biographies and histories, including The Zealot and The Emancipator, which is right over my shoulder here, and which he spoke on last year, literally last year at this time, as part of the Concord Museum Forum Series. Two of his biographies, The First American and Traitor to His Class, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. So thank you, Bill, for joining us this evening. I really enjoyed this new volume, our first Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution. I highly recommend it to our viewers. And I should note that in November, before the recent resurgence of COVID, we began having in-person events and had Nat Philbrick here speaking on his new book. And I should note that Mr. Philbrick has described this new volume as, quote, a sleek, riveting, one-volume account of the American Revolution that speaks compellingly to our current age of division and discord, a bravura performance by one of our great historical storytellers. As any of you who have heard Bill speak in the past, he is a wonderful raconteur and storyteller. So rather than having me interfere with that flow, we've asked him to give an overview of the book for 30 to 40 minutes or so, at which point I'll ask a few questions, and we welcome inquiries from you, which you can submit via the chat feature on YouTube, and Allison, my colleague, will text those to me, and I'll ask your questions to Professor Brands. So Bill, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, Tom, thanks for that very kind introduction. Thank you for having me back. I'm delighted to speak to your audience once again. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote a book on the American Revolution. There have been plenty of books written about the American Revolution. So what is there left to say? And actually, I get these sort of questions fairly often, and I have a couple of answers. And one of the answers, the answer that's sort of expected by book review editors and by specialists in the field is, okay, well, I've got new stuff, or a new angle, a new way of looking at it. And I think I do a little bit, and I'll elaborate on that. But the more honest answer is, and the one that I don't always give to everybody, is that if you can tell an important story well, it doesn't really matter if it's been told before. And I become aware of this, actually, in a way that a lot of my colleagues in the academic world do not. Because if you exist in the academic world, if a book was published on the American Revolution, Charles Andrews wrote a book on the Loyalists in the American Revolution that's probably published, must have been in the 1940s. A book that is 70 years, 80 years old is still in existence, is still alive, is still available for academics because they have access to libraries, but most people don't. And so the general reader really can't get a hold of a book that's not available for sale somewhere. And so I find that when I think of it that way, I don't have to compete with people who wrote wonderful books 50 years ago, because those books might as well be out of existence. And I'll say this, that I do hope that specialists in the American Revolution might find something useful here. And I'm very pleased with that kind remark by Nat Philbrick about the book. But my principal audience is people who remember a little bit about the American Revolution, a little bit of what they were taught in school, or maybe they read somewhere else, but they don't really remember it very much. And one of the things that I try to do with my readers, I do this with my students as well, and that's another thing. The readers that I'm aiming for, I think of as, and this is not meant in any disrespect for our viewers this evening, but I think their average age is a bit older than my students. So they're an older version of my students. When I say that, what I mean is that my students, I teach at the University of Texas, and I make a point of teaching introductory courses. In essence, these are required courses. And most of the students in my class are not going to be history majors. In fact, at the beginning of the semester each year, I ask the students, how many of you are in this class because you have to be? And 95% of the students raise their hands. So these are the chemists and the engineers and the computer scientists and the physicists and the pre-meds and everything else. And I think, okay, well, that's fine, because I take it as a bit of a challenge. And I try to make them think that history wasn't what they thought they wanted to study when they came to the university. but they might decide there's something interesting here. Now, in this day and age, I don't really go out of my way to try to make history majors out of them. But what I do have in mind is to persuade them. History can be interesting. Now, like very many people whose last exposure to history was in high school, they come out thinking that history is pretty dull stuff. It consists of names and dates and not much else to hang things on. And so actually, I find that I have a bit of an advantage over my colleagues in the sciences who are teaching the required courses, the major courses for these students, because I used to be a math teacher. And I like to think that I taught math in an interesting way, but the core material in math, unless you're really a mathy kind of person, it's utilitarian at best. And so for my general ed students in my history class, I basically explain to them and then follow through by saying, I'm going to tell you stories in here. So sit back. And my idea is that if I can persuade them that history is interesting, then it's almost immaterial how much material they learn of information about American history while they're in the 4.5 months of my class. Because if they think it's interesting, then they'll have the opportunity to teach themselves history for the rest of their lives. History is a remarkably accessible subject. If you want to learn physics, you need a physics teacher. But if you're going to learn history, all you need is a library. You need to be able to read and have access to books. Anyway, so these are the people that I wrote this book for. And it's a book about the American Revolution. And so I start with what's the simple take? What's the one-line description of the American Revolution that most people have in their mind? And it is, Americans got fed up with bad laws passed by Britain. They proclaim independence, they fight a war, and they win. There we go. So we got the United States. And one of the things that draws me to history is the fact that it's always more complicated than that. And one of the principles that I've sort of adduced from history, my study of history, is that it's always more complicated than you think. And in fact, no matter how complicated you think it is, it's more complicated than that. And so one of the things that I try to do with this story is to point out the complications. And so in the first part, Americans get fed up with Britain and declare independence. Well, that's really only half the story, because by no means did all Americans get fed up with British laws, and not all of them were on board for independence. And so this is the story that I tell. And I call the book somewhat maybe mischievously or provocatively, our first Civil War. But I do try to make the case that this was as much a war of Americans against Americans as it was of Americans against Britons. And it's interesting, I'll say more on this toward the end, but that's a part of the story that was convenient for both winners and losers in the war to forget about. Because after the war was over, well, I'll come to that. But anyway, so this is the story that I want to tell. The longer I teach, the more I'm convinced that the big questions of history are essentially, well, at some basic level, they are moral questions. So what will you do? What is the right thing to do at this particular moment? When I spoke to your group last year about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, the question is, what are you going to do about slavery? John Brown and Abraham Lincoln agreed that slavery was wrong, but that's only half the problem. What are you going to do about it? So the question that I pose here in my book on, well, what I call our first Civil War, and I'll probably lapse into this usage before we're done today, but when I talk about the other Civil War, the one of the 1860s, then I have to make that distinction. But anyway, so the question that I pose for my readers, but a question that I really pose to the individuals that I focus on, is what causes a man, and because the ones I focus on primarily are men, what causes a man to forsake his country and take arms against it? And I think it's worth a reminder that that is exactly what the revolutionaries did, the ones who called themselves patriots. And sometimes I present this, for example, to my students, but to people audiences that I'm lecturing to. What would provoke you to say, I no longer consider myself loyal to this country and I will take arms against it? I try to point out that this is a big step. And so the question is, what prompts people to do this? And the flip side of the question is, what prompts other people who are not that much different from those who did forsake their country and take arms against it to make the opposite decision, that is to remain loyal and not to take arms, and in fact, to oppose those who did take arms. So this is the question that I pose. And when I put it this way, I like to think that it will encourage readers to take a closer look at things they think they already are pretty comfortable with in their knowledge. So because we know how things turned out, it's natural for us to think that, well, of course, George Washington was going to become a patriot, a rebel, and was going to lead this country to victory, because we know how it turned out. And Benjamin Franklin. So it's sometimes been said that the two really indispensable figures in the American Revolution were George Washington, the military leader, and Benjamin Franklin, a Boston boy who grew up in Philadelphia, moved to Philadelphia, and who sort of led the political and diplomatic part of the war effort. And so, because we know how it turns out, of course, Franklin's going to be a rebel. Of course, Washington's going to be a rebel, but there really shouldn't be any of course about it at all. Because in the way things normally go, the people who become revolutionaries are people for whom the status quo isn't working very well. But the status quo was working really well for George Washington, for Benjamin Franklin. George Washington, perhaps the wealthiest man in Virginia, certainly one of the most distinguished people in Virginia. And if you were living in Virginia in the 1760s and 1770s, you probably would have said, George Washington has it made. Boy, I wish I could be like George Washington. But whatever George Washington perceived of his life, it wasn't enough. And so he had these ideas that drove him to an act of rebellion. And we call it rebellion, we call it a revolution. What the British called it was treason. And that's sort of exactly what it was under British laws. So what drove George Washington to treason? That's the question I try to tease out. And again, I'll share with the audience this evening what I perceive to be one of the most important aspects, one of the most important techniques for trying to understand history. And it's going to sound a little bit paradoxical because it seems to be just the opposite for what historians do. And that is what I'm going to ask, what I ask my readers to do, what I ask my viewers and listeners, my students to do, is to forget how things turned out, to forget what they know about the things that happened after the time we're examining. Because the people that we're looking at didn't know how things were going to turn out. When George Washington signed the Declaration of Independence, I don't think he did sign the Declaration of Independence, but when he was on board with this, and he didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't know if they were going to win. And he might have been hanged and drawn and quartered by the British for this. And so in order to understand what was at stake, what was behind the decisions, it's really important to forget how it turned out. And that's the only way that you can get inside the heads of the people we're looking at. And this reflects a little bit of an approach that I take to history. And it's not the same approach that every historian takes to history, but it is as much as possible to try to get inside the heads of the people that I'm looking at. And this is why in writing a book about the American Revolution, I cannot help but writing it in a biographical mode. I've written some freestanding biographies. So here's a life of Andrew Jackson, one of Ronald Reagan, and so on. But everything else that I write, whether I'm writing about the California Gold Rush or the American Revolution or whatever it might be, they turn out to be biographical because I want to know what the world looked like to those people. So as much as possible, I try to convey to my readers what the world looked like to George Washington, what the world looked like to Benjamin Franklin, and so on. And so why they made the decisions they made. So this is part of the story, explaining why these people became rebels. But the other half of the story is explaining why other people, again, not that much different than Washington and Franklin, became loyalists. Except when I say that, I have to stop myself and say, wait a minute, these people didn't become loyalists. They simply were loyalists. They kept doing what they were doing. And for them, the experience of the Revolutionary War was exceedingly disconcerting because they found themselves branded as traitors for nothing that they had done. In their case, treason is a pretty big deal. It's one of the most heinous crimes that anyone can commit in pretty much any political system. And normally, crimes of that order, sins of that order, are crimes of commission. You did something, you made this decision. But for the Loyalists, they were being called traitors for a sin of omission. They didn't turncoat against the crown and against the government that they had grown up under. And so I posed that question. Why did they do it? Why did they take that course and not the other one? And this brings me into kind of the dual realm of history. And I think of history as taking place along two arcs. There's the arc of big history. So this is the stuff that happens in public view. This is the history of the Declaration of Independence and the Battle of Yorktown. And it's the history of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. It's the big stuff. It's the marquee items in history textbooks. So that's big history, and it's a big deal. And this is the kind of thing we're interested in. I wrote a book about the American Revolution. That's big history. But going on at the same time as big history is unfolding, there's also what I call little history. And little history is a history of individual lives. And what happened to you this morning? My father was, for years, my father was something of my model reader. He was not a historian. He was an engineer by training. He ran his own business for most of his adult life, but he always had an interest in history. And years ago, many years, he's been deceased now for 10 years, but he had Douglas Southall Freeman's biography of George Washington. And it's something like 7 volumes. And my dad was really impressed because he used to say, read that and you know what George Washington had for breakfast every day of his life. And the level of detail is pretty much that way. So, but that part is little history. It's the history of, okay, so what did you do today? And why did you do this? Why did you do that? It's big history, for the most part, is the history of the famous people. Little history is the history of everybody. But even the famous people, George Washington, what did he have for breakfast? That's the little history of George Washington. And Benjamin Franklin, he tamed lightning and all this other stuff, but he had a really hard time getting along with his son. And that's a large part of my story. So when I'm talking about the book, sometimes I simply tell the story of the two Franklins. And we got Benjamin Franklin, the famous Franklin, the one who was born Boston, lived in Boston till he was 17 and then ran away. He ran away from an apprenticeship that his father had signed him up for. He ran away from the authority of his father and his elder brother, James, the one he was apprenticed to. He also broke the law in doing so because the law enforced these indenture arrangements. And so he was a fugitive. And he intended to go to New York, sort of the next city down the coast, where he thought he could get a job. But at the time he arrived, there weren't any jobs for printers. So he just kept going to Philadelphia. And it was Franklin's very good luck. One could argue it was America's good luck that New York didn't have any printers, because if Franklin had found a job there, he probably would have become attached to New York. Now, maybe his history would have been different, but it turned out that Philadelphia, which was the most tolerant, open-minded city, probably in the British Empire, conceivably almost in the world in the early 1700s, was a perfect fit for Franklin. And so Franklin grew up with Philadelphia. So Franklin is this person who develops a certain set of character traits. The character traits that somewhat mirror what's happening in Philadelphia. But one aspect of the story, and so in the course of the book, I never quite boil it down to this, but the question is always there. So why was there an American Revolution? What was it that caused the American Revolution? And this is something that historians of the American Revolution have been talking about forever and ever. Why was there an American Revolution? How revolutionary was the American Revolution? What was going on here? What prompted it? And there are the economic arguments, and there are the psychological arguments, there are the political arguments, there are the diplomatic arguments, there are all these sorts of arguments. And all of these sort of add up. But what I want to look at is how they play out in the lives of individuals. So with Franklin, like George Washington, was one of the least likely revolutionaries you could imagine, because Franklin, well, here's a question. By the time I pose this question when I'm talking about this, I've already telegraphed what the answer is, but I'll put the question to our audience this evening. If there had never been an American Revolution, which of the founding generation, which of the founding fathers would you have ever heard of? Would you have heard of George Washington? Quite possibly not. George Washington became famous because he was commander of the Continental Army. No revolution, no Continental Army. Would you have heard of Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson, wonderful pen. You know, he really understood political philosophy and all this, but he became famous because he drafted the Declaration of Independence. No revolution, no Declaration of Independence. The only member of that group that we know we would have heard of is Benjamin Franklin. How do we know this? Because he was already world famous before the revolution began. Another striking thing about this, revolution, challenges to the status quo. These are typically things that young people do. We expect the younger generation to reject what their parents have done, what their parents teach. In Franklin's case, it was the older generation, the oldest generation. And Franklin's 70 years old when he becomes a revolutionary. What's going on there? So this is the thing that has to be explained. And this is where big history intersects little history. Because Franklin went from Philadelphia, he made his fortune as a printer, and he had enough money by the time he was in early 40s that he could retire from the active practice of his business, and he went into philanthropy, he went into public affairs, he went into politics, and he eventually was chosen by the Pennsylvania Assembly, the provincial legislature, to represent them in London to the British government, because they always had the things they wanted stifled by the royally appointed governor. And in their case, by the proprietors, the Penn family, who still had this ownership stake in Pennsylvania. And so off he goes to London. And if Franklin had thought Philadelphia was an improvement over Boston, which he certainly did, he thought that London was even better than Philadelphia, because London was the cosmopolis of the empire. And he had everything in London that somebody of his inquisitive nature, that someone of his bon vivant style of life could really enjoy. In fact, here's another striking sort of little tidbits of the little history. Benjamin Franklin so fell in love with London during the first couple of years there that he thought very seriously about relocating permanently to London. And he would have. He tried to get his wife, Debbie, to join him, but she didn't want it. She didn't want to go. She was a Philadelphia girl. She knew that she wouldn't fit in to the society in which Franklin was moving. And so Franklin sort of never lost his Philadelphia, his Pennsylvania, his American anchor. But still, he spent most of his time in London. And he became this sort of lion of London society. But he also became something of a target for those elements of the British political classes who disapproved with great anger of what the turbulent Americans were doing. And so this is the period from 1765, the Stamp Act, to 1775, basically. And so Franklin, who was a very adept individual, he was very good at representing the interests of the Americans. He was, again and again, called before Parliament to talk about the Stamp Act and the riots after the Stamp Act and so on. And there were groups in London. There were some who were relatively sympathetic to the Americans, but the groups who were in power starting in the late 1760s and continuing through the 1770s were groups that thought the Americans needed to be brought to heel. And it was this group that kept pushing the Americans, and people like Sam Adams and James Otis and others on the American side kept pushing back. And Franklin is still there in London at the time of the Boston Tea Party of late 1773. And when the news arrives in London, Franklin is called before the British Privy Council to explain what the Americans had done, and also to answer for something that Franklin himself had been compelled to admit having done. Somebody handed Franklin some letters that were written by Thomas Hutchinson, at that time the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. He would become governor of Massachusetts, who was saying that the rights of Englishmen in America would have to be suspended or curtailed in order to suppress this growing insurgency. And this was a soundbite that just inflamed the emerging revolutionary movement. Because, see, they'd been saying that there was a conspiracy against Americans' rights as English rights, and now Hutchinson has said it. Now, Franklin, in passing these letters along, so he sent them to Philadelphia, and so he sent them to Boston. And he sent them to Boston, and Samuel Cushing got a hold of them. And Franklin said, don't publish these. Now, it's hard to know with Franklin whether he was being naive that these weren't going to be published, but in fact, they were ultimately published. But Franklin's thinking was, if he could persuade hotheads like Sam Adams that it was just a bad apple, it was Hutchinson who was the problem. The problem was not Britain. It wasn't Britain's philosophy of government. Then the easy solution for the British government would be just fire Hutchinson, put somebody else in there, and all will be well. It's really important to try to recapture Franklin's thinking, because Franklin, far from being trigger happy in his opposition to Britain, he was the last one to get on board. Not exactly, but Franklin was not simply a loyal subject of the British Empire. He was an enthusiast of the British Empire. And it took a lot to push him over the edge, but that lot happened in January 1774, when Franklin was hauled before the Privy Council, the King's Council of Ministers, and was made to stand and endure an hour and a half of slander, of abuse, of diatribe by the King's Solicitor General, a man named Alexander Wedderburn. And Wedderburn called Franklin a traitor, a liar, a thief, just the whole thing. And Franklin stood there, and I'll confess to maybe taking a little bit of liberty with this, but I think that it's exaggerating only a little bit, if at all, to say that Franklin walked into that session before the British Privy Council. This is January 1774. He walked into that session an Englishman. He walked out an American, because Franklin concluded, if this is the way they're going to treat me, if they're going to treat me, someone who has been loyal, who has been trying to mend the differences between the two sides, someone who, and Franklin did not underestimate his own talents. So, I'm smarter, I'm more virtuous, I'm a better subject of the British crown than any of the people in this room. But they're not going to let me be a full Englishman because I'm a provincial, because I'm an American. So Franklin decides pretty much then and there, this is the end. And the American colonies have to become independent. So that's Frank. Oh, and one of the first things that he does is to write a letter to his son, William Franklin, who at this time is the royal governor of New Jersey. And he got that job in part with the assistance of his father. His father put in a good word for him, and William Franklin, the son, made this, he becomes the governor of New Jersey. And Benjamin Franklin writes a letter to William, basically assuming that William is going to take Ben's side in this, because Ben Franklin explains how I've been insulted, and extrapolates this to say all of us Americans have been insulted. But William Franklin doesn't want to go there. And so the question is, why not? And part of the answer is that William Franklin had a job that he liked. Being governor of New Jersey, that's not so bad. But beyond that, it was a matter of, he didn't think that the complaints of the Americans rose to the level of breaking up the empire. And pretty much every American thought that some of the laws the British had passed were not very well advised. But this is the difference between reformers and revolutionaries. The reformers think, it's like when you take a car into the mechanic, and a reformer would say, well, okay, we've got some problems, let's fix them. but we keep the car, and so you fix the car. The revolutionaries basically, the mechanic says, you can't salvage this car, so just junk it and buy a new one. And William Franklin wasn't willing to go that far. He simply didn't think that the grievances of the Americans rose to that level. But beyond that, there was something else. And it had to do with the fact that in a very crucial way, William Franklin was a son of his father. Because when Benjamin Franklin left Boston at the age of 17, he essentially revolted against his father, because his father had said, you got to finish out that apprenticeship. You have to do what your brother James tells you to do. He's your master as well as your older brother. And Franklin said, to heck with this, I'm out of here. And so he was willing to defy his father in pursuit of something that he thought was necessary for him to do. Well, this is exactly what William Franklin did against his own father. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but this is it's a story at the heart of the broader story. And it'll allow me to sort of wrap up this portion of my comments by explaining sort of what happened to the Loyalists, because I'm not going to explain what happened to all of them, but I am going to explain what happened to William Franklin. William Franklin remained loyal to the king and to Parliament. And for his loyalty, he was branded a traitor by the rebel, that is the traitorous New Jersey legislature. So William Franklin had been basically going to work every day, doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing again and again and again. And one day he wakes up and is being told, you're a traitor. And it's, well, what do you mean I'm a traitor? What did I do? You didn't break with the government. He was arrested. He was imprisoned. He nearly died while he was in prison. He eventually was traded. He was in a prisoner swap. He wound up in New York City, which was the focus of American loyalism during the war, because it's where the British Army was stationed. He engaged in various sort of guerrilla war activities against Patriots. He was the leader of the American Loyalists at the time. And after the Battle of Yorktown, when the British Army decides we're leaving, then William Franklin says, okay, I got to get out of here too. So he sails off to England. And William Franklin discovered something that pretty much all of the Loyalists discovered, that for their service to the crown, for their service to the British Parliament, what they got was essentially a cold shoulder. No thanks, no parades. A few of them, William Franklin had a relatively small pension for a while. Thomas Hutchinson was another who was in this group. But nobody in England wanted to associate with them. Certainly, the king didn't receive them and say, thanks for the good work and all this stuff. So I didn't start out writing this book with the idea of drawing parallels to the recent history and to the present and so on, but they kept cropping up. And so when I thought about what happened to the Loyalists, what happened to the Loyalists in their treatment by the British, I was reminded first of the reception given many American veterans of the Vietnam War. When they came home, there were no victory parades. Well, of course, there wasn't a victory. And same thing was true for the American Loyalists when they go to Britain. But more than that, there was this almost a conscious decision on the part of the British government, almost like the American government, let's just forget these folks because they're a reminder of this bad chapter in our history. And so William Franklin finds himself, he's not exactly destitute, but his lifestyle is much less than it had been before. And while he's in England after the war, he receives a letter, actually a series of letters, from his son, Benjamin Franklin's grandson. Benjamin Franklin spent most of the war in Paris, negotiating on behalf of the United States to get French support. And Benjamin Franklin became very embittered toward his son, William, because William had remained loyal to the British. And so the two, in effect, were fighting against each other. And Ben Franklin just could not get himself around a position where he could say, he's a grown man, William Franklin was. He has a right to make his own decisions. After the war ended, So, Benjamin Franklin took his grandson, William Franklin's son, with him to Paris when he went, effectively stealing Temple Franklin, the grandson, from his father and making him a patriot rather than a loyalist. But Temple Franklin, for understandable reasons, this is where we get back to the little history stuff, he is very upset that his family has been torn apart by the war. He had to choose between his father and his grandfather. And now the war has ended. And Ben Franklin's going to go home from Paris. And Temple thinks, okay, here's my chance. I can bring my father and my grandfather back together. So Temple Franklin writes letters to William Franklin in England. Temple doesn't tell Ben Franklin he's doing this. But he tells his father, William, he misrepresents Ben Franklin. He says, grandfather wants to put the family back together. Grandfather wants to forget the war and move on. And William Franklin dearly wants this to happen. And so he responds very positively. And then Temple says, and on our way from France back to America, the ship is going to stop in Southampton. So if you can get yourself to Southampton, you can meet us and we can have this reunion. So Temple and Ben come on the ship and they land at Southampton. And there are all these people around. Many of them see Franklin, they remember Franklin, clap on the back and all this stuff. For everybody else that Franklin became estranged from in the war, everybody else he's willing to reconcile with. But then he sees William Franklin. And William Franklin immediately realizes that it wasn't Ben's idea. In fact, Ben doesn't even know this is happening. And so William shows up and Ben is standing there. And William is trying to reconcile. So William, at this time, William's 50 years old, so you're a full-grown man. And he says, Father, the war is over. We can become family again. And he reaches out his hand to his father. And here's where I, as the author, as the historian, when I write history, I do my best not to get emotionally involved. I want to keep an arm's distance from my subjects so that I'm not going to be sort of swept up in what they're doing. I just want to be able to see them as they are. But this was one of those cases where when William Franklin sticks out his hand to his father, offers reconciliation, peace again after the war. And Ben was hesitating. It was all I could do not to want to reach across centuries of history and grab Ben Franklin by the arm and say, damn it, take that hand. But he wouldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And William Franklin's desire, Temple Franklin's desire, that the family be made whole again, falls to pieces because Ben Franklin could not get over the wound that he had felt because his son had not followed him into rebellion. So I'll stop there. I think we can have a conversation now and maybe questions from some of the audience.
Sure, we've got a few questions, and there's so much to talk about. But why don't you talk a little bit about the role of slavery and enslaved people and the decisions and choices that they needed to make?
Yeah, so when I talk about the Loyalists and the Patriots, I point out that effectively everybody in the colonies had to make a choice. Whose side are you on? And it was really the Patriots, the rebels, who are driving this decision because they want to force people to make decisions. And the decisions had to be made by people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, but they also had to be made by just ordinary folks, including many of the enslaved peoples who lived in the American colonies. And this question arose in a particularly pointed form when fairly early in the fighting, even before the Americans declare independence, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, makes an offer to slaves of rebel masters. If you leave your masters and come join the British Army and fight for your freedom, you will receive your freedom. And so this really poses the question in a very distinct way, very striking way. And now, for obvious reasons, the slave holders did their best not to let this word get out, but it did. And so one of the individuals that I focus on is a man named Boston King. He was a slave in the Carolinas. And he heard about this, and he heard about this British offer. And he has to decide what to do about it. And just like everybody else, just like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, he has to weigh, well, what do you think is right? What do you think is practical? If you do make this step, what are your chances of succeeding? So Boston King has to decide, do I take up the British offer of freedom? Well, what are the risks? Well, the first risk is I got to flee my current owner, and I got to make my escape. If I get caught en route, then I will be punished the way fugitive slaves always are. If I get to the British lines, well, none of the slaves ever saw anything in writing. This is something they just hear by word of mouth. Is this really legit? Is this what the policy is? Can I rely on their promise? And then looking forward, so what happens if the British lose the war? Where am I then? What happens if they win the war? So everybody has to make these kind of calculations. And Boston King, he waits and waits. And here's where that little history side comes in, because one of the reasons I can tell the story of Boston King is he later wrote the story. He wrote a memoir after all this was over. And he explained that he acknowledged that as far as slaves went, he had life pretty good when he was growing up. He was something of a pet on the plantation because his father was a very skilled labor, very valuable to the master. And so Boston King says, I really didn't have to do any work when I was a kid. And even when I got a little bit older and old enough to work, things weren't particularly bad. And so he was willing to go along with the status quo until, and this is sort of crucial, this is Boston King's equivalent of Franklin's being insulted before the Privy Council. Boston King has been accused of a theft that he didn't do. And he was going to be punished for something that he hadn't done. And he finally says, enough is enough. So he flees to the British side. And I'm able to tell the story because he told the story of his adventures during the war, and he gets involved in various battles and so on. And he winds up in New York. And this is pretty much where all the Loyalists went to by the time of and shortly after the Battle of Yorktown, because after Yorktown, it's pretty clear that the British are going to be pulling out. The only question is when and under what circumstances. And King is there in New York, and they're getting stories about the negotiation of the peace treaty in Paris. I mean, Benjamin Franklin is in the middle of all of this. And questions involve, okay, so what's going to be the territory of the new country? And how are reparations going to be made, restitution, and so on? And one of the big questions is, will property seized from the Patriots by the British and property seized from the Loyalists by the Patriots, will it be restored after the war? And the British agree in Paris to restore such property as they can. They're not going to carry off property that they've acquired during the war. Now, it wasn't written out explicitly in the treaty, but everybody understood that property included property in humans, that is, slaves. And the news arrives in New York among all the Loyalists there, but especially among, by this time, there are at least hundreds of former slaves who accepted this offer. The total number was in the thousands, but in New York at the time, there were hundreds of them. And they heard that this was one of the articles of the treaty, that the property was going to be returned. And they went, oh my God, this means I'm going to be sent back to slavery. And certainly my fighting on behalf of the British is going to be held against, and this is going to be a really bad deal. But Boston King was one of the first, and all the other former slaves in New York were among the first beneficiaries of something that would outrage Americans over the next decade. In fact, the British did not live up to the terms of the treaty. And in fact, the British took the position, we promised these people freedom, they're going to get their freedom. And so the evacuation of New York involved perhaps as many as 100,000 people. And among those were thousands of slaves, former slaves, that had accepted this offer. And Boston King like very many of the Loyalists, headed off to Canada. Now, I'll stop here and just say that my book was finished. It was off at the printer by last summer. In particular, by the time the Biden administration announced the United States is pulling out of Afghanistan. And as soon as the news got abroad that American troops are pulling out of Afghanistan, then everybody in Afghanistan who had been associated with the United States during the 20 years of the war, they're scrambling to figure out, what are they going to do? If they stay in Afghanistan, are they going to be killed? Are they going to be thrown into prison? You know, they're really trying to make the best they can. And I was reminded then, this is last summer, that wars always end messily. And because I've been talking about the end of the American Revolutionary War, well, the end of the Revolutionary War was a messy affair too. And so Boston King scrambles away and he gets to Canada. But the evacuation, the dynamics of the two evacuations, Afghanistan in 2021, New York in 1782, they were very similar. In the case of Boston King, he gets to Canada. He eventually goes to England. He winds up in West Africa, and he is one of the colonists in the British colony for former slaves in Sierra Leone. So that's part of the story. I'll add that another group of people who had to make decisions, another group and groups of people, were American Indians, the Native Americans, and they had to choose. And one of the characters in my book is Joseph Brant, who was the chief of the Mohawks, part of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations of the Iroquois. And Brant has to make a similar kind of calculation. So do I choose the British or do I choose the Americans? If he chooses the British, in effect, he is a loyalist because Native Americans are Americans too, so he's a loyalist. Now, he decides to stick with the British. And part of this was personal. He had had a good personal relationship with a man named William Johnson, who was the principal British Indian agent for the New York, Pennsylvania area where Joseph Brant lived. Some of it was a calculated decision that the fortunes of the indigenous peoples would be better served by having two centers of power in North America, because then the Mohawks, for example, could play, let's say, in an independent United States against Britain. If the British were driven out, then they would essentially be at the mercy of the Americans. And so Brant makes this decision. And so, and I also point out that women were involved in all of this. Sometimes they were actors themselves, but sometimes they were sort of drawn along. So Joseph Galloway is one of my examples of the Loyalists. And he was a prominent Pennsylvania resident, and he was sort of right alongside Benjamin Franklin in the path toward independence. But he finally, at the end, he said, no, you know, this doesn't warrant a war, and we can still fix things up. So Joseph Galloway is a prominent Loyalist, and his wife, Grace Groudon Galloway, is kind of dragged along the way wives often were. Abigail Adams basically became a patriot because her husband did. And in the case of Grace Galloway, it's a very poignant story. Again, I'm able to tell the story because she kept a diary during all of this. And it's a reminder to me as a historian that we historians are really prisoners of our sources. And if there aren't records, and because as historians we don't make stuff up, you know, we're kind of stuck. But when you do find a source like Grace Galloway's journal, her diary of her time in Philadelphia under the British occupation, well, she was a loyalist. She was an enthusiastic loyalist. And when the British were in Philadelphia, she was doing great. Everything was fine. But of course, the British eventually evacuated Philadelphia. And then the Patriots come back in. Turned out that the commander, the American commander of Philadelphia, was Benedict Arnold, who is another one of my characters. And he's one who makes the decision for independence or against independence a couple of times, and he changes his mind. And it's just getting back to something I said earlier. It's just a reminder of how complicated this whole business was.
We have too many questions, but let me throw two of them at you. These are from the audience. Were the Loyalists mostly affluent? And then the second question was, why was the violence between Patriots and Loyalists more intense and widespread in the southern colonies than in the north?
Okay, so I'll answer the second part of the question first, and that is that the Loyalists were more numerous in the South than they were in the North. So if you were to draw sort of a map showing the gradient of revolution, Boston was really the centerpiece of it, and things sort of spread from there. But it took a while for it to get to the South. The South was more agricultural, and so there wasn't sort of the city-centered radicalism of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. But for a variety of reasons, there were more Loyalists in the South. And so Joseph Galloway, among others, the Pennsylvania Loyalists, explained to the British that they would be really smart to shift the focus of their fighting from the mid-colonies, from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, to the South, because they'd have more friends there. And they could build this position of strength in the South. But in the South, there were sharper class divisions than there were in the North. And the class divisions often showed up. And so superimposed over this question of, are you for Britain or against Britain? There was a question, okay, well, how do you stand on who owns property and who doesn't? And as to why the fighting was so intense between Patriots and Loyalists, I think it is a fairly common characteristic of civil wars that pit neighbors against neighbors, brother against brother. In the case of the Franklin family, father against son. There's an emotional intensity that is manifest there that you don't see when the soldiers fighting are simply strangers to each other. So most of the soldiers in the Continental Army had nothing personal against soldiers in the British Army, or let alone the Hessian mercenaries. They didn't even know them. And for the British, for the Hessians, this was just a job. But when you had Americans fighting against Americans, there were memories, there were old wounds. These were these people who knew each other, and there was often a sense of betrayal from one on both sides with respect to the other in a way that there wasn't. You can't be betrayed by somebody who's from a different country. You can be betrayed by a member of your family. So that was sort of part of the occasion of the intensity, but it is definitely true. In fact, I begin the book with the fighting on the southern frontier, and it's absolutely brutal. And the worst atrocities were of Loyalists against Patriots and then Patriots against Loyalists. And sort of this sets the scene for the story. And now I don't remember what the first part of the question was.
Where you were getting to the question about whether Loyalists were more affluent. If you were more affluent, were you more likely to be a Loyalist?
I don't think that I can say that. First of all, there's no way of getting at what the average income of the Loyalists was. I would say, and in fact, some of the wealthiest Americans, John Hancock, George Washington, people like this, they were very wealthy and they became patriots. I would say if you had to identify sort of general descriptors that might predict loyalism, it often was involved with service in the British government. So it's not simply a coincidence that Thomas Hutchinson, governor of Massachusetts, royal governor of Massachusetts, and William Franklin, royal governor of New Jersey, were loyalists. But one has to remember that probably one of the reasons that Hutchinson became governor and that William Franklin became governor was that they already had demonstrated a support for British policies. And so it wasn't simply that they wanted to keep their jobs. It was the kind of things that made them good nominees for those jobs were the sort of things that conduce to loyalism. Some of it was geographic, some of it had to do with economic connections. So New York City was heavily loyalist, and because there was a recognition that a war with Britain would disrupt their livelihoods, and you can't continue to trade with a country that you're fighting against. And this, and I don't tell the story of the extended aftermath of the American Revolution, but as soon as the war is over, there is a party in America, becomes associated with the Federalist Party, that wants to restore relations with Britain pretty much as they were before the war, because, at least in part, because that is where their economic interest lies. So, and I should add one thing, that one of the things that makes this civil war different from that other civil war, the one of the 1860s, is that there's no geographic line that separates loyalism from patriotism. Now, it's worth remembering that in the Civil War of the 1860s, things weren't that simple either. In every Southern state, there were Unionists. However, once the decision was made, the Unionists, they were effectively silenced, or in some cases driven out. But in the American Revolution, what I call our first Civil War, there was no dividing line. And so the line between loyalists and patriots, it went down the middle of households, it went through the middle of communities, and so on. I'll add one thing about this, and that is it gets back to the question that I raised earlier: how revolutionary was the American Revolution? And the answer is, well, compared to other revolutions, it doesn't seem so revolutionary. So the models of revolutions, the American Revolution is really not usually taken as a model for revolutions. The French Revolution is the model, or the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution. And one of the reasons those become models is precisely because they are so bloody. And the French Terror shows what a revolution can really do. And the Russian Revolution, its own way, was as bloody, and the Chinese Revolution, and so on. One of the reasons, a principal reason the American Revolution never descended to that degree of violence, is that the losers had some place to go. The losers had an exit strategy. The losers in the French Revolution, some of the emigres got away, but most of them simply had to stay and take it. And so the winners, if they're going to get rid of that reactionary group, they're tempted to, and they did, we got to kill a lot of them. And the same thing is true in Russia, and the same thing is true in China. But this gets back to the question of why the story of the Loyalists has largely been forgotten. Because after the war is over, I've sort of said that the British didn't like to be reminded of it. So the British have no incentive to tell the story of the American Loyalists, just as what I would call the Afghan Loyalists. I shouldn't use that term because they weren't loyal to, America's Afghan allies. They were in the news for 2 weeks, but they're not in the news anymore. And 5 years from now, they will be forgotten, unless some of them were lucky enough maybe to get away and move next door to you or something like that. But it's not a story that Americans have any incentive to continue to tell. Likewise, for the American Loyalists in the American Revolution when they get to Britain. As for the Americans, the winners, the patriots, they have no incentive to tell the story of the American Loyalists because they want to project the image of a united America, because of course, what's it called? It's called the United States of America. Loyalists, the continuing existence of loyalists gives a lie to the concept of a United States of America. So for the winners, they have every incentive to just write them out of history. But the fact that they can get away is crucial. And because they can get away, then there's no real, serious bloodletting. Score settling is relatively modest after the American Revolutionary War. It wouldn't have been that way, I think, if the Loyalists had to stick around.
Time for one more question, and I know this is a larger question debated in a lot of academic circles, but I'm just going to ask it the way this questioner asked it. Would you say that one reason for the Revolutionary War was because the British wanted to end slavery, and many of the colonists did not want to end slavery?
No, that's not one of the reasons for the American Revolutionary War. The British did not want to end slavery. There was a legal decision, Somerset decision, within England that said that there's not going to be slavery within England, but the British were still full on with transporting slaves across the Atlantic. They were making a lot of money there, and slavery was perfectly legal in the British West Indies, and everyone expected it would last years and years. The only degree to which it looked as though the British were opposed to slavery during the American Revolution was this tactical decision to offer freedom to the slaves of patriot masters. By the way, that offer was not good for the slaves of loyalist masters. This was not, well, actually, it was sort of like the Emancipation Proclamation in that the Emancipation Proclamation in that other Civil War exempted the slaves of, I'll call them loyalist, unionist masters. So slavery persisted in Maryland and in Kentucky, Missouri, after the Emancipation Proclamation. So the British were not in principle or in practice opposed to slavery. So it wasn't a matter of, oh, and so certainly there were some American slave owners who wanted to keep their slaves. They thought that was important. And there was the opposition to slavery among even, well, first of all, it's worth a reminder that slavery was legal in every state in the Union at the time of independence. So no, it's quite a stretch. In fact, it's a real misreading of history to think that the American Revolution was in some important way a struggle on the part of slaveholding America to oppose the emancipationist influences of Britain.
Great. Thank you. You're such a prolific author. Are you willing to tell us the next book that you're writing on as you give the book tour on this one?
Well, the next book that's coming out jumps to the 19th century. I find myself jumping back and forth between the 18th and 19th century, and occasionally to the 20th century. But the book that's coming out, the next one, is going to be called The Last Campaign. And it's about William Sherman in his post-Civil War command and Geronimo, the last war chief of the Apaches. So it's about the end of the Indian Wars, or so the way I'm configuring it is, it's called The Last Campaign, Sherman, Geronimo, and the War for America. So in some ways, and I mean, the American Revolution is a war for America, and it certainly did involve Indian tribes, but it takes us up to the end of the Indian Wars in the 1880s. So that's the next one.
Well, we will look forward to having you back here in Concord to talk about that book when it's out. Bill Brands, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We thank all of you as well for taking the time, and we could tell Bill how fortunate your students are at the University of Texas, and as your readers, we feel fortunate again to learn so much about our country's history through your wonderful way with words and storytelling. So thank you for being here with us this evening.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for tuning in this evening.
Great. Okay. Good night. Good night.
Bye-bye.